Introduction to the federal city had been so engrossing that when Victor Navasky and Kai Bird asked me if I would consider moving there permanently for the magazine, I scarcely hesitated. On my departure for Washington, Victor brought me a farewell lunch at a restaurant near Pennsylvania Station, known as the wily and parsimonious Navasky, in consequence of an imperishable column by Calvin Trillin, in which the latter had recorded his being hired for a payment, somewhere in the low two figures. Victor may have been narrow with the magazine's money, but he was always very generous with his own, and it was a pretty decent snack. A different kind of wiliness had also helped him persuade me to move south. He had remarked casually that the Nation hadn't had a regular Washington columnist since I.F. Stone. This name was a magic to all 60s radicals and to earlier generations too. Stone had published his own weekly sheet of investigations and polemics, exposing the war makers and the segregationists, and actually made a living out of being an independent, non-alienated producer of printed words on the page. The good life of the pamphleteer. So flattered and excited was I by this latent comparison that I fell into the Trillin trap and forgot to ask about an exact salary figure until it was very slightly too late. I was looking forward to fighting back against the Reaganites in their capital city, and in such distinguished company as Izzy Stone's. At that, he had promised to host a reception in my honor when I got there. But I still registered a twinge at quitting Manhattan. And this twinge became a pang as, moving forward the door of the restaurant, I had an alluring glimpse of Susan Sontag taking her lunch with Roger Strauss. I knew Susan slightly by then. She was a sovereign figure in the small world of those who tilled the field of ideas. She didn't have any boss, but she didn't have a distinguished book publisher who was also a friend and who was proud to print anything she wrote. Obviously my pang was part envy. Susan, political as she was, didn't have to lead the very politicized life that I was about to embark on. To become a Washingtonian is to choose a very odd way of becoming an American. It felt at first like moving to a company town where nothing ever actually got itself made. The typical local look was that of a lawyer, almost indistinguishable, in both the male and female cases, from that of legislative aid. Dowdiness was a theme. On the streets of New York, one's visual sense was constantly assailed and tortured by a fiesta of distraction. In my new home, I found I could walk almost the whole length of Connecticut Avenue without having to turn my head for a second look. So much the better, perhaps, since for the first time in my working life, I wasn't going to an office where there were congenial fellow scribblers, but was having to evolve a stern daily and weekly discipline of my own, and at home. In my search for an inexpensive place to live, I soon discovered that there was a very stark discrepancy between the city's neighborhoods, and that this discrepancy was no less starkly demarcated. In 1982, and for some years afterward, you could still see the scarred and burned-out area, from eastern downtown to the districts behind the then dilapidated and disused Union Station, and right up through Capitol Hill, that dated from the riots in 1968. The smallness of D.C. made an additional shock to realize quite how close to the White House and to the Dome that righteous mayhem had come. After staying for a bit with a Zimbabwean friend at the World Bank and then a British correspondent of some standing, I came to appreciate that I couldn't and perhaps shouldn't afford their leafy neighborhoods of the Northwest. I found a row house in northeast Capitol Hill, where if I wanted to cab it home late at night from the DuPont Circle, African-born taxi drivers would sometimes decline to take me, on the unarguable, at least by me with them, grounds that it was a black area. I have never since been able to use the word gentrification as a sneer. The unavoidable truth is that it is almost invariably a good symptom. Other areas of the city were being cheered up at a more rapid rate. DuPont Circle itself was being redone by an immigration of gay couples with spending money, who fixed up the housing stock and opened cafes and specialty stores. In Adams Morgan, the city's little Latin quarter, there was some music to hear and an ethnic mix from Ethiopian to El Salvadorian, where nobody predominated unduly. Georgetown still had its hostesses in those days, and I was somewhat befriended by one of the very nicest of them, Joan Bingham. In this female-dominated circle, which had always formed a part of the Anglo-American special relationship, and which eventually went into eclipse along with it, there were still to be found grandes dames like Catherine Graham and Susan Mary Alsop and Evangeline Bruce and Kay Hawley. And as Oscar Wilde once remarked of Frank Harris, I was invited to all of these great salons once. Since I was in the city to work for an American magazine, while all of my British friends were naturally enough writing for London ones, my perspective had perforce to alter, and my personal way of becoming Americanized was to remain a blood brother of the American left. I felt a kinship with this in any case. The tradition of Marx's great solidarity with Lincoln in the Civil War, the great and humane figure of Eugene Debs, the mighty class battles of the 1930s that baptized the labor movement, which then helped co-sponsor the March on Washington in 1963. Through men like Izzy Stone, I was introduced to some veterans of these heart-stirring episodes. Then Ralph Nader invited me to lunch and offered me the strange sum of $7,000 if I would give up smoking, which I didn't, or didn't then. The taunt against us by the Reagan-Kirkpatrick faction was that we were anti-American, and when we criticized Israeli expansionism, anti-Semitic. In parallel with this came the accusation that, in the Cold War, we regarded the United States and the USSR as morally equivalent. One grew used to countering this line of attack and adept at saying that America was being untrue to itself when, say, it tolerated death squads in El Salvador. In the Israeli case, as Stone was fond of pointing out, there was more criticism of government policy in the Jerusalem press than in the American one. Jewish leftist critics of Zionism were to be found all over the American scene, and nothing about them was self-hating. The other fork of the anti-Semitic indictment. On the moral equivalence charge, I had a little more difficulty. My old Trotskyism had taught me to be much more anti-Soviet than many of my comrades, and I was often made aware in nation circles that there really were people who did think that Joseph McCarthy had been far, far worse than Joseph Stalin. But on thermonuclear weapons, for example, I did feel that there was an approximate moral equivalence, which got worse as American strategists began to use extremist phrases such as launch on warning, and I thought South Africa more nearly met the definition of a totalitarian state than did, for example, Hungary. I fell into correspondence with Noam Chomsky on some of these points, and used to go and visit him up in Cambridge. On one occasion, speaking on the same platform in defense of Cyprus, he worried me once by saying that as far as he could see, the moral equivalence calculus favored the Soviet Union, but I filed this under another heading. My much admired Gore Vidal worried me once or twice too. I went down to Lynchburg, Virginia, in the early Reagan days, to see him trail his coat and tease the faithful at a public lecture in Jerry Falwell's hometown. This he did brilliantly. I took Young and me along for the ride, and we all three had dinner, as if helpfully introducing an innocent Martin to the native loam of America. Gore happened to mention the FBI and broke off to tell him confidingly, "You know, that's our KGB." I could feel Martin resisting his glibness. He later wrote that Gore, while a great performer, needed to know that there was something radically, nay terminally wrong with his smile. Not very much later I was made to cringe myself by Vidal's response to a bitter charge of anti-Americanism from Norman Podhoretz. He began well enough by saying airily that he could hardly be accused of hatred for a nation of which he was the official biographer. That was a fair enough riposte, in view of the body of fiction about the life and history of the Republic that had so carefully and lovingly composed. Things got a touch less lofty when Gore then rounded on Podhoretz and accused him of being an Israeli rather than an American. This chanced to be in a special edition of The Nation about patriotism and internationalism, It upset Alexander Cockburn and myself enough for us to express our reservations to Novoski. With one of the shrugs for which he was famous, Victor, who secretly welcomed the notoriety that it would bring the magazine, said, "Well, gore is gore." This I was later to find true enough.